Okay. Well, we'll get on now. And while I'm just introducing the webinar, you'll notice the barcode there, or the QR code, and don't please feel free to download the report from that. So hello and welcome, and in some cases it's good morning as well, to our webinar, Awaking Takeoff, where we'll explore the strategic thinking behind aviation's decarbonisation strategy. I'm Simon Perrin, part of the engagement team here at the Tracker Group. Today's session will run for approximately 55 minutes. We'll begin with a short presentation from Rich Collett-White and Syed Rasul Ashrankanoff, who will walk us through the key findings of our latest report. And again, as I said, you can access that report, Awaking Takeoff, via the QR code shown during the presentation, not only on this, but a couple of other slides later on. Following on from that, we'll move into a panel discussion featuring voices from policy, finance, and the industry, and then we'll open the floor for your questions. To submit a question, please use the Q&A function and include your name. So if we don't get around to answering it live, we can get in touch with you afterwards. Joining Rich and Syed today are Trishla Shah, a manager in the sustainable aviation part of Systemiq. Systemiq is a system change company working on pragmatic, investable solutions to build a sustainable economy. We also have Gabrielle Lapin, Vice President of Finance at ZeroAvia, a leading developer of hydrogen electric propulsion systems for aircraft, and Menzo Reinders, a Director of Energy Sector Coverage at ING Bank. And we're delighted to say moderating today's discussion is Celeste Hicks, Policy Manager at the Aviation Environment Federation, a leading NGO focused on reducing aviation's environmental impact. So, Rich, over to you.
Great, thanks, Simon, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Delighted to see so many of you here with us today, and really looking forward to the panel discussion later. So just before we start on the presentation, I'm just going to give a quick introduction about us. So we're Carbon Tracker. We're part of the Tracker Group alongside Planet Tracker, and we produce research really to align global finance with climate and nature goals. And just to give a brief kind of overview of our research program, we're really interested in highlighting and analyzing climate and nature risk across these different themes. And you can take a look at the various breakdowns of those. And you can really find all of our research on our websites. It's all freely available, and also on various financial third-party platforms, some of which are listed below. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Syed, who's going to paint a picture really of the decarbonisation backdrop for aviation, the options available, and then I'm going to take us through our research on new propulsion aircraft, which we'll explain later in the presentation. Over to you, Syed.
Thank you very much, Rich. Right. To set the context for the presentation, for the contents of the webinar, I think it's worth highlighting a few statistics. Many of you may have heard them already. Aviation accounts for 2.5% of global CO2 emissions. When you take into account non-CO2 emissions like methane, NOx, etc., that is more likely to be around 4% of all anthropogenic GHG emissions. And over time, if nothing is done about those emissions, they're going to grow. And you see here on the screen, the growth is about 60%, which means that urgent action needs to be taken for aviation to be for aviation emissions to be curtailed. And for now, it's more of a laggard in the industry. Moving on, for a sector that's often described as hard to abate, it has a surprisingly wide range of different options available and in review. And you see them, the 6 of them on the screen right now. We will focus primarily today on the first 2, which is sustainable aviation fuels, and I will explain a couple of minutes later why we put sustainable in quotation marks, and then new propulsion aircraft, which is what we're just going to talk about. But it's worth touching even briefly at a very high level on the 4 other options. So the first one is efficiency improvements. So it's tweaks to aircraft to improve fuel efficiency, or maybe even redesigning airframes to make them more fuel efficient, which is an important step, but it's unlikely to make a dent in emissions in the future. The other part is demand management. So it's lots of different policy measures that would reduce demand for flight. However, this is a difficult policy decision, and we'll not be exploring this at this stage. Then there are offsets, and offsets have been beset with lots of different integrity issues, and it has yet to be seen whether CORSIA, the new offset measure, will work. And finally, this is DAX, which is carbon dioxide removals. And while they may play some residual role in emissions reductions, it's not quite clear whether they are scalable, whether they can be deployed at scale. Now, one of the solutions, and probably the most prominent solution on the market today, is SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuels, and the industry at large is promoting it as the big driver of emissions reductions in the future. So the industry body, IATA, is claiming that SAF will account for 65% of emissions reductions to 2050. Meanwhile, plane makers are saying that they are producing or are retooling aircraft to make them 100% SAF compatible, which means that they'll be able to fly fully on sustainable aviation fuels. However, with $19.8 billion invested so far, SAF will only account for 0.7% of total jet fuel consumption this year. And based on the preliminary results of the analysis that we're doing right now, the commitments that we have today are unlikely to be in excess of 2% by 2030. To understand the limitations of SAF, to understand the advantages and disadvantages, I guess it's worth highlighting and explaining what SAF is and how we perceive it. And I think it's worth discussing what SAF is, what SAF is not. SAF is a drop-in fuel, which means it's chemically identical to kerosene, to fossil kerosene, which you see at the very top, in the blue bar at the very top. It's a product of different pathways. It's a product of different feedstocks. And what SAF isn't is actually, it's not sustainable, not in its entirety. Given the whole variety of feedstocks and different varieties of pathways, a alternative jet fuel, as we like to call it, can come with lots of different emission intensities. And for example, for alternative jet fuel to be at least CORSIA aligned, it needs to have an emission intensity of 90% of the fossil fuels, so of the fossil kerosene, which isn't a lot, which isn't a tall order. So there needs to be a little bit of nuance in discussions around SAF. And obviously, we need to pay attention to all the different pros and cons that SAF has. So on the left-hand side, you see a few of the pros. Obviously, SAF has a huge advantage of being a drop-in fuel, is that you can use existing aircraft, existing fleet with just minor tweaks. You also don't need new infrastructure. You can reuse the pipelines. And there is a notable reduction in non-CO2 emissions, specifically soot. Can we go back a slide? I'm not sure why. Thank you. Yeah, specifically soot. And obviously, some emission reductions will be possible, and the industry is advocating for it itself, as I mentioned earlier. But then there are also problems, is that at the end of the day, the tailpipe emissions will be the same, and the only savings you get are from the CO2 absorbed upstream in the production, then SAF comes at a cost premium, and it is the case for all the different pathways. And then there are feedstock supply constraints. It's a very fragmented market, and there just isn't enough feedstock for now to go around. Then there are opportunity costs. Can you find a use case for the fuel in other industries? And obviously the impact on biodiversity and agricultural implications for food security. With the context that said, there must be other solutions, and I will hand over to Rich to discuss the core of our presentation.
Thank you, Saeed. So moving on, with all of that kind of in mind, as Saeed says, it is quite misleading to kind of describe all possible alternative fuels as sustainable, and we do think that it comes with some quite serious risks of locking in fossil fuel assets on the promise of SAF that may never kind of fully materialize or may not be as sustainable as claimed. And just to kind of give an illustration of that, on the right there, you can see the very large order backlogs for Airbus and Boeing for conventional aircraft. And kind of linked to that, there's a risk of policy lock-in really here, and less attention on alternative solutions. And one of those solutions is new propulsion aircraft, and that may not be a term that everyone's familiar with. Maybe you're more familiar with zero-emission aircraft. They are used interchangeably often, but zero-emission aircraft would really exclude hybrids, because hybrids combine either hydrogen or electric with a conventional engine, and they're very different technologies. We think that they could be feasible for short and potentially medium haul flights, but the long haul picture is, for the foreseeable future, not going to be feasible. There are significant technical challenges, but they're not insurmountable. There are test flights and commercialization taking place currently, and we'll obviously hear from ZeroAvia later in the panel. And one of the big advantages, really, even if we can't get zero-emission aircraft for long haul, if you can scale it up for the short and potentially medium haul, then you're freeing up that kind of limited SAF supply for the long haul. And so, taking a deeper dive into the current market for new propulsion aircraft, looking first at manufacturers, it is still a very, very small market compared to conventional. You can see there that for 2024, the total figures for orders of new propulsion aircraft really are dwarfed by conventional aircraft being manufactured by Airbus and Boeing, and it's really fair to say that the industry has taken a step back of late. So Airbus's programs have been delayed. Their ZeroE program on hydrogen, and ATR's hybrid electric program has also been pushed back. And so if we look kind of to one more level down, looking at the particular manufacturers who are taking firm orders of these aircraft currently, they're essentially all startups. Many of them you won't have come across, maybe one or two you have, and you can see that hybrid electric are really leading the market currently. And now looking at those customers for new propulsion aircraft, you can see that there was strong growth through 2023, but that's really fallen back of late. And on the right there, you can see customers of those aircraft, and there's a conspicuous absence really there for the major airlines. There are a couple of exceptions, Air Canada, but most of them you won't have heard of. They're fairly kind of niche operators, and that's really a concern, because airlines, there are some shorter routes that are amenable to new propulsion aircraft, and they're not sort of being placing those orders yet. And so we do think that there's a significant disruption potential here, despite that slightly pessimistic current outlook. If we're looking further ahead into the kind of medium to long term, there are significant numbers of new entrants who could really pose a risk to the incumbents. We think that China is likely to be a front runner here in developing electric aircraft. It has significant kind of strategic reasons to cut down on its oil imports, and this would be one way of doing that. And China, alongside Japan, have undertaken some major hydrogen aircraft programs as well, and looking at the EU as well, there's significant funding for new propulsion aircraft R&D. Not enough, we would say, but it is starting. And some other examples there from Rolls-Royce and EasyJet. And we do think that there are some parallels here with road transport. Obviously, it is a very different sector, but initially electric vehicles and electric trucks were kind of dismissed as sort of impossible. You can't get enough energy density in the batteries, but that's changed significantly over the years. There was initially a kind of overemphasis on biofuels as the solution, and you could kind of see some parallels there, I think, with the current emphasis on some bio-based alternative aviation fuels. And so kind of summing this up for what the risks are really to the industry, we think they fall into these three kind of broad brackets. So we've got policy risk, as policymakers can really no longer ignore aviation emissions going up, and if those alternative fuels don't reduce emissions to the extent hoped for, and the feedstocks aren't there, then there's going to be a kind of policy risk for the industry, and then also reputational and litigation risk, and that I think really stems from potentially greenwashing allegations against the industry, and then finally potential financial risks in the form of stranded assets. Obviously, that's not going to happen immediately, but we've got to bear in mind that these aircraft are typically used for 25, sometimes 30 years, and that risk could kind of arise further down the line. And so just to round off the presentation, here are the kind of major recommendations that we would make to, firstly, investors and then to policymakers. So for investors, we think there's a lot more disclosure needed on CapEx and R&D spend at the manufacturers. Also, a lot more disclosure on where different alternative fuels are being sourced, and also the adoption of zero-emission aircraft or new propulsion aircraft at airlines. We also think executive remuneration could be tied more closely with decarbonisation. And then we think different industry actors could provide more kind of insightful assessments of both transition risk and climate impact under different scenarios. And then finally, for policymakers, there's an array of different policies that could be explored: grants, public procurement, sales mandates, carbon pricing, demand management, and then also kind of requiring more zero-emission ready infrastructure for airport expansion. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Celeste to kick off the panel. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi, thank you very much for that, Rich. That was really interesting, and I especially like your focus on looking at this idea of sustainable aviation fuel. because I think that is one of those things that's just taken on, that it is sustainable, and I think people don't always understand the reasons for why it's called sustainable and what needs to be in place. So I think that's a really good starting point for the discussion. Simon's just asked me to remind you all, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. You'll find it at the bottom of the toolbar. If you want to ask a question there, we'll try and get through as many as we can. Right, so we'll get started really with that idea of SAF and what the barriers to SAF are. So as you'd explained in your presentation, there are many reasons, partly to do with availability of feedstock and the comparative price of that. So I might start with Trishla. Can you talk about what the structural barriers to large-scale deployment of SAF are, and why is it taking such a long time, and why is there not enough SAF on the market?
Yeah, happy to. I'll start with SAF and I'll just comment briefly on the zero emissions propulsion as well. So for SAF, I think we see three major real hurdles. So firstly, the feedstock limitations, Saeed and Rich talked about quite a bit. So for bio-based SAF, you've got highly constrained waste oils and fats, which are the current feedstocks that are being used at the moment, and just kind of fundamentally limited sustainable supply of biomass feedstocks. On eSAF, you have quite a different dynamic. So in the next decade or so, we're likely to see a constraint on feedstock as well. And then in the future, we're likely to see more abundant renewable electricity. And then secondly, efficiency. So conventional SAF is capped by turbine efficiency, and eSAF converts only about 10 to 15% of the renewable power into usable jet fuel. So SAF-based routes are just inherently less efficient compared to zero emissions propulsion. And finally, the last kind of physical barrier on SAF is really that it doesn't solve the full problem. It doesn't solve the contrails and non-CO2 problem entirely. However, for zero emissions propulsion, there are also, I think, a couple of major real hurdles that you do need to note. So, the physical limits on energy density, which really constrain the range and size, are not ones that are surmountable in the near future, and therefore you do see a role for SAF emerging at least in medium to long haul flights. And secondly, these solutions do require entirely new infrastructure, refueling infrastructure, drivetrains, aircraft, supply chain. So it's quite a big lift, and it's the reason why we see policy kind of shying away from it a little bit, because it's so complex. So this already tells us that there's no single solution that is perfect. It can't be used, there's not a single one that can be used across the board. You'll always need a combination of both to reach net zero. But I think some of the more artificial hurdles that we're seeing are, some of the kind of the huge price hurdle. When I talk to airlines a lot through my work in Project Skypower, and when you actually look at the ticket price impact of both SAFs and zero emission propulsion, it is quite modest for SAFs, particularly in the early years where blending mandates remain fairly low in Europe and the UK. And policy and international cooperation can really overcome the hypersensitivity to competition risks. And so, there's huge opportunities through ICAO, ETS adjustments, or SAF like C-band style measures that ensure fair competition. And one thing I'll just be very quick, possibly the most frustrating is the rising argument, and I'm sure we'll come to this in a second, but it's the rising argument in support of using fossil fuel plus DAC to solve our problems, which I think is a bit of a distraction. And it takes away from it kind of pushes out any need for action in the near term, which I think is one of the artificial hurdles and a framing issue rather than real issue.
Yeah, we will get onto that. I was just interested to hear when you talk to airlines, from your insight in that conversation, why is it then that everybody seems to just think that the answer is SAF and let's move on? Because I think that's one of the stories I hear, is just that, we've got SAF, so we don't need to do anything else. Why do the airlines kind of continue that if they know?
It's as simple as it's drop-in, and for them, it's what they know. And I think it's also one of the key reasons why SAF has become the leading solution, not only because it's drop-in, but also because it complements the existing setup of the industry, right? It's oil majors that are really building out SAF at a meaningful scale, at least on the bio-SAF side. So it maintains the status quo. So, supplier relationships between airlines and suppliers can be maintained. It doesn't require huge amounts of change from the airline perspective or from the supplier perspective. And I think that kind of inertia is what is keeping SAF as the main solution that they're exploring.
Yeah, so we'll move on to talk about eSAF. So I think it was explained in the presentation, but essentially these are synthetic fuels, which are seen as the most sustainable of any sustainable aviation fuels available. But currently they're absolutely tiny proportion of what's available in terms of SAF. I might come to you, Menzo. Can you sort of explain how feasible eSAF is currently, and if you're looking at it from an investment perspective, is this something that people want to invest in right now?
I think it's important to approach this problem of aviation decarbonization from multiple angles. So indeed, there's currently HEFA-based SAF, which is the majority. But then the benefit, obviously, of eSAF is that it doesn't involve the shortage of feedstock. It can be produced in a very clean way using solar or wind. But the challenge is that it is much more expensive. And that's what we see at the moment, really, as a hurdle for these projects to take FID. So conventional jet fuel is around $800 per ton. For eSAF, this is around anywhere between 5,000 and 8,000 or north of that. So this means it's not just a little bit more expensive. There's really a huge gap in terms of pricing. And the other problem is that at the moment there are, let's say, for example, in Europe, around 40 projects that are looking to take FID to produce eSAF. But in Europe, none of them have taken FID yet. So that means there isn't really a market yet. It's very difficult to determine a price. And if you finance a project or if you want to be an off-taker, you need to have a price to at least establish a market and understand what the risks of the project are. So this is one of the key problems at the moment, that it's much too expensive. So probably what you need there is some form of government intervention to bridge the price gap, because we currently see that the mandate itself, the mandate that's kicking in 2030, by itself may not be enough to actually get to FID for let's say these projects.
Yeah, so from AEF's perspective, and I know I'm not a panelist, but I'm using my prerogative as chair. We are really most interested in the climate benefits of any of these solutions. So eSAF, the challenges with eSAF are also to do with the intensity of the resources required to go into the eSAF as feedstock. So, for example, what the impacts are on renewable energy production, because eSAF needs huge amounts of renewable energy. And also it needs green hydrogen, and green hydrogen also needs to go to other sectors of the economy. So I think for that reason, that's why this idea of continuing to burn fossil kerosene and then take that out of the atmosphere using DAC, so direct air capture, is also talked about. So Trishula, you mentioned this before. Do you think that's a viable option?
I think so. I mean, a simple answer is no. In my opinion, it's really not. And I think, as I said, it is a bit of a distraction. I have three main issues with it. And I've been leading the Project Sky Power initiative for the last couple of years. So a lot of what I've been looking at has been in comparison to eSAF. I think with fossil plus DACs, the first and most obvious challenge is it creates fossil lock-in. So continuing to ban fossil kerosene means, locking in the high upstream emissions from oil extraction and refining, delaying the shift to new propulsion, delaying investments in SAF, all for the promise of this future technology, which, may or may not reach the scale that it's needed. And it just really gives oil majors a longer runway and a green light on continuing to extract and grow business as usual. Second, it is still an early stage technology, very, very limited scale at the moment. Current plants capture in the tens of thousands of tons, while aviation emits close to a gigaton. To neutralize that with DACs, you'd need tens of thousands of the mammoth scale plants, and we're currently at single-digit small scale facilities. And if this technology fails to scale, aviation is just essentially left stranded with no alternative abatement pathway, if it doesn't scale the other technologies. And finally, I have no confidence around the economic analysis that I see these days, because it doesn't account for a post-fossil oil world. In a net zero system, if oil is really being extracted mainly for kerosene, we can't use the oil prices of today. The price of fossil jet fuel will rise sharply as demand from other sectors collapses. So this means, the burn kerosene plus DACs option is not, in my opinion, cheaper in the long run, which is what usually the argument is built on. And even in comparison to ESAF, you see cost reductions coming down, whereas this option has costs going up over time.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very important, as you say, to look at it from a systems-wide perspective and not see aviation in isolation. So I think I might come to Gabriel now. We're just sort of talking here about all the challenges to do with the technologies that we've discussed so far, and obviously you work for ZeroAvia, and you're hoping to bring your new technology to a popular market. What kind of how do you see this where you stand? I think, earlier Rich mentioned the parallels possibly with the car industry in the 90s, where people were talking about hydrogen fuel cells for cars and no one was really talking about electric. Do you think that we might be at a moment like that with aviation, that any one of these solutions could win out? And how do we sort of know which is the right one to back? And I know your answer will be ZeroAvia is the right one to back, but how should people approach this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think maybe going back to the other points made, I think if we step back as an industry and we want to decarbonize the aviation, I think we can't rely on any silver bullet. So we will need all these different technology pathways that we've been talking about. And what we are working at ZeroAvia is hydrogen electric. And we think that's a very promising technology to decarbonize the long-term aviation, to have a full climate impact, and ultimately over time, as hydrogen prices come down, bring economic benefits for customers. So in my mind, you mentioned what the transition was in the road sector. We see there's a lot of similarities on how we can think about the adoption to aviation. And how we can work as an ecosystem around policies, so mandates and incentives, which worked well in terms of getting zero-emission vehicles road adoption. So for aviation, things like zero-emission flight quotas, green fuel blending, and tax credits. We talk about the supply chain and the economics. The road transport did a good job around economies of scale and creating EV gigafactories to aggregate manufacturing and supply chain, which we'll need here to bring costs down. And then ultimately, I think it's about demoing the technology and starting small into a market that works and then scaling up over time.
And how important is the role of policy on this? If we look at in the UK, the UK Jet Zero strategy, which was launched by the previous government, had policy to cover SAF, which was obviously the SAF mandate, and then policy to cover things like carbon pricing, which was basically the emissions trading scheme. But we don't see any real policy other than some research and development funding on new propulsion aviation or hydrogen electric or battery electric. Why do you think there is no policy in the UK, and what kind of policy might be catalytic in this circumstance?
Yeah, you bring a great question. And I think to bring these new technology, innovate the technology, bring this technology to market and make it commercially viable, we need government policy to bring these technology forth. it is across R&D, which is well established today, but these technologies are capital intensive, so more is needed. But then other things such as policies for demo, so large scale demo projects, which we've benefited from at ZeroAvia around manufacturing, so financial support for innovators to scale manufacturing, and also policy around market making tools in order to ensure a commercial pathway once the technology is mature, and also overall regulation. So it's multifaceted in order to bring this technology to commercial relevance and make a real impact.
Thank you. Rich, I thought I might bring you in here because I know you've got an interest in what's happening in China. They, I think, and as far as I understand, have quite different policy landscape in China. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening there and what developments we might see coming from China?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, as I mentioned a bit in the presentation, you know, there are big programs both for electric and hydrogen aviation, and in the case of electric, that's really kind of leveraging China's huge kind of battery manufacturing capacity and R&D. So CATL is working with COMAC on electric aircraft, and you know that could really challenge some of the incumbents going forward. I mean, it's still some way off that it'll be really fully commercialized, and then there's obviously a question of, you know, to what extent will those products be kind of on the market in say in Europe and US, given you know, the picture on tariffs at the moment. But you know that there is significant kind of development going on in China. There is also the China SAF policy as well, with a mandate coming forward. So that really raises another issue of, you know, if everyone's kind of scaling up SAF mandates across the world, that's going to put even more pressure on kind of feedstock availability. Obviously, a lot of SAF is imported from Asia currently to Europe. So, you know, what will happen if more of that is consumed within Asia itself? So yeah, those are just a few thoughts on China.
Thanks. And Menzo, just to bring you in here on this idea of attracting investment, you know, I think we talked a little bit with Gabriel about the idea that, you know, you can see some parallels with the road transport market, but one of the big issues in aviation is that the assets are so expensive. So, you know, when you buy a plane, it's enormous, and you know, it's not like just replacing the family car and everybody's can just kind of buy a car, and it doesn't take that long to replace the fleet. Replacing the fleet is an enormous job. How do you get investors interested in that when it seems that the sort of actual, you know, the product that you're buying is such a big, expensive thing, and people might not want to back the wrong technology?
That's an excellent question, and indeed, aircraft are extremely expensive. I used to finance aircraft in a previous job, and indeed, the loans themselves already go from 12 to 15 years, and by that time, the asset still has a second life left. So the buyer of the aircraft will really need to assess, especially the leasing companies, assess the value not just in the short run but in the long run as well. And for that, they'll make these investment decisions on a very prudent basis. So they will need to make sure that the value after the initial lifetime is still at such a level that they can sell it on. And for that, these new technologies are really something that without government support, I don't believe will become economically viable in the short run. So this is obviously something that in my mind will need an outside disruptor, just like indeed you've seen in the car industry, someone that starts small and then expands and really has a different angle that competes in a different way from the current incumbents.
Yes, I've heard a lot of talk about where is aviation's Elon Musk, for better or worse. Right, maybe we can just bring in a few audience questions now. So I had a question from Greta, who was asking about hydrogen combustion. So just I think that maybe Gabriel is slightly different to what ZeroAvia is doing, I believe, with hydrogen fuel cell. But I don't know, maybe who would like to take the question on? Maybe it's a Rich and Said question about the viability of hydrogen combustion. Would one of you like to take that?
Shall I take this one? I think a lot of the problems that Trishna has already mentioned in her first answer apply here. It's not just a question of sourcing feedstock, which already is going to be quite expensive, given the costs associated with electrolyzers, and then just electricity in general. The hope is that that's going to go down as more renewable capacity is being rolled out. There are also problems with designing the aircraft the right way, because hydrogen needs to be stored in a cryogenic chamber, so that requires significant modifications to aircraft. And then hydrogen itself is less energy dense than fossil kerosene and just kerosene in general. So that needs to be accommodated. So I think those are hurdles currently on the adoption of combustion. And just in terms of technology in general, we're not privy to that, but we know that Rolls-Royce is developing that technology, and there are other companies that are pursuing that as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a dizzying selection of technologies or solutions to this. And I think actually it might be worth going to this question from Darren Graham as well in the chat, which is just looking at the difference between SAF and eSAF. As he correctly points out, yes, eSAF does still emit much less on a life cycle basis, but he's pointing to these problems with the fact that the CO2 has to be, sorry, I'm sorry, I'm reading the question while I'm talking, but he's talking about the fact that the renewable electricity needs to be taken from the grid to produce the eSAF and the impact on hydrogen production. I don't know, Trishla, have you got a view on sort of how eSAF increased production would impact on other sectors of the economy, and whether that would lead to the best climate outcomes if, for example, everybody hogs the renewable electricity production for something that is such a dense process?
Yeah, it's something we've looked into a lot, and I mean, it's no secret that eSAF production and just hydrogen production in general is not the most efficient process. But we don't have kind of the luxury of time to decarbonize one sector after another. We can't just, do the most efficient and then go one by one because of market dynamics. We know that these industries will take 30, 40 years to scale. And so what I like about Refuel EU and the UK SAF mandates is that they, first of all, require additionality. So it's creating additional demand pressures to really scale up supply for renewable electricity, but also that it keeps the blending volumes relatively low in early years. So you're not putting huge amounts of pressure onto the system. We've done the analysis on eSAF, and under Refuel EU, the eSAF, the renewable electricity that would be required for eSAF, if it were produced within Europe entirely, which is just unrealistic by 2040, would require less than 8% of the kind of the total renewable electricity supply that we would expect at that stage. So I think we put a lot of emphasis on this issue, and obviously, it's not. It is something to be aware of, the diversion of renewable electricity from other sectors. But I think there's a way where we can do it in decarbonize sectors in parallel and start to scale up the technologies that we'll need to get them to a mature enough commercial, enough scale when we need to really deploy them at scale. We can't really just wait until all the other sectors are taken care of.
Yeah, and I have a question for Menzo, which is something that I've heard a lot from fuel producers and airlines, is that e-fuels go hand in hand with direct air capture and actually sort of storing the carbon under the ground. So you kind of have one pathway for the development of direct air capture, and then you have another pathway for using some of that CO2 to produce e-fuels. And I hear it sort of argued quite convincingly that the two things have to happen together, that they can't happen separately. I just question that because I think if one of those pathways ends up being cheaper than the other, then everybody's going to go for the cheaper pathway. Do you have any insight on that?
Look, I think the key here is that you need to have a form of CO2 as a feedstock into your ESOF that's not of fossil nature. So direct air capture is one way to get such CO2, and I think the elegant part of that is that you actually reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere. But there's other ways to obtain CO2 that's not of fossil nature. So there's biogenic CO2, and there's multiple ways to obtain that. So it's not necessarily that this is the only pathway to get ESAF is through direct air capture.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going back to the questions. Michael Disabato has asked a question about assuming electric aircraft aren't really going to be deployed at scale until 2050 at least. How can we ask or hope what policies can be implemented to speed up the development of zero and electric aircraft? I might give that question to Gabriel.
Yeah, so policies to spur and deliver technology that will decarbonize the overall industry. I think we touched upon a couple of them, but it's around first, these are technologies that we need to innovate and deliver. So policies around R&D in order to have a R&D roadmap that delivers grants or tax credits to de-risk private investment and spur more innovation, because we need a pathway around liquid hydrogen or battery density to deliver electrification in the sector. I think also as these technologies mature and are getting proven through large-scale demo projects, we need to bring these technologies to market. So financial support for these innovators around scaling manufacturing and bringing first-of-a-kind product to market will be important. And then two other elements I'll talk about is around policy. So market-making tools, i.e. either carrots or sticks, to ensure that there's a commercial pathway once the technology is mature to deliver and have a visible offtake to scale up the technology into the marketplace. And then lastly, around regulation to ensure that global standards are harmonized in order to deliver the product, because aviation is such a global industry.
Yeah, well, I think that leads nicely into another question which I wanted to ask, which was about compliance markets. So, we basically have CORSIA, which is the UN offsetting scheme, and then we have various emissions trading schemes in Europe and the UK. Kind of the only places where you can force people to buy these things. So Said, there's a question from Moston about basically essentially the weakness of CORSIA, saying that's giving the fact that the carbon intensity of SAF in CORSIA is set at 10% reduction means that there's a little incentive to develop anything more effective. Do you know how we can push forward the scene in CORSIA, if there's any hope that CORSIA could become more ambitious and actually drive development of better technologies?
Thank you, Celeste. I think my answer will be in three parts. The first one is that CORSIA is primarily an offsetting scheme, not a SAF scheme. So the idea is to limit emissions from aviation, international emissions, to what they were in 2019 at around 85% of that levels. So SAF comes in as a sort of a supporting measure there. And the other bit is that in any way, airlines will need to reduce their emissions in one way or another, either by actually not emitting anything in excess of 85%, or using offsets, or using SAF. So I guess their performance will be measured in absolute terms. And finally, you just rightly mentioned that there are different jurisdictions which have different sort of standards. And if I'm not mistaken, in the UK, the requirement is for SAF to be reach at least a 40% reduction in emissions, and in the EU that's like 65%. But yeah, Rich, do correct me if I'm wrong. But generally, these are more stringent requirements, and they have more stringent requirements for feedstock, which means that at least in those jurisdictions, the SAF that will be offtaken there will be more or less sustainable compared with what can be passed in CORSIA. I guess for a comparison of what the life cycle emissions are going to be from different types of feedstock and pathways, the ICAO's technical document for CORSIA would be the first port of call. They have different emissions factors there, and they can be summed up, both core emissions and induced land use emissions. So I would direct you there.
Okay, thank you. We're getting close to time now, so I think we'll just take one more question from the chat. I think perhaps Arnaud Lemont's question could be interesting. I think it's probably to you, Rich, is you seem to be suggesting that a new production aircraft is likely to be taking the lead over eSAF. Or does he mean fuel, SAF or eSAF? Sorry, I'll read the question. During the presentation, I understood that you think NPA fuel are likely to be taking the lead over eSAF. Can you elaborate on that? Would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think for the short haul routes, yes, I think it could well be more economic going forward than eSAF. But for the long haul routes, yeah, I think you are going to need to rely on alternative fuels if you want to kind of decarbonize those going forward. So yeah, there's a real, as we've seen, you know, a real array of different solutions for different parts of the industry, and yeah, we just have to kind of plot a path forward that really is most sort of economically efficient and kind of and yeah, as sustainable as possible. But it's going to be different for different parts of the market.
Okay, and I feel like the maybe summing up question should go to Trishula quickly. Is you know, we're hearing all these different types of technology from a systems perspective, because I know that's what you work on. How does this get regulated? What will be the thing that shifts it in one direction or another? If possible to answer that question, it might be too big.
It's a very big question. We do look at the full suite of solutions, and we've tried to, you know, map out where each solution makes most sense, and it is a relatively academic exercise when you do it that way, and then you start talking to policymakers and you start talking to industry, and you understand what the practical challenges are to deploying those multiple solutions. I think what we really need is a better understanding at the kind of policymaker level and within industry and in the investment community, but also a comprehensive regulation. You know, not I mean, I'm a big fan of the SAF mandates, but I think it can be extended to be more comprehensive and really explicitly stating the role for the different solutions in different segments of the market, so that you don't create lock-in to, you know, the least or less optimal solutions in the wrong segments, like, you know, creating SAF lock-in into the short haul flights. So I think we do need a comprehensive policy framework that accounts for the different segments and the right solutions in each segment.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's time to wrap up now, so I'm going to hand back to Simon.
Thank you, Celeste. A really great panel. Excellent. I think just to wrap up, I wanted to finish on a couple of points that Lord Deben made. Rather sadly, he was unable to join us today. He was called away. There's quite a lot going on, as you would imagine, at the moment in the peers for the peers to look over. So he was very a late call away. But it went on one of the calls that we had prior. He talked about a couple of things. He said the first thing of all for this is that there is no silver bullet. It's going to be a multi-solution through time. But he said the first thing we need to do is we need to separate, we need to be honest with ourselves, and we need to separate what are the real problems, what are the structural problems, and what are the artificial barriers that are put there by someone or our own thinking. And the second thing he pointed out, which may be a little bit controversial, but he said aviation has got to stop thinking that they are special, that somehow they are exceptional, they are allowed to play by a different set of rules to everybody else. And so really just to draw a conclusion, the reality is investors have got to ask more questions from the industry when they're looking at these questions. And for those particular, for some ideas about questions to ask, do have a look at our report awaiting takeoff. I think there's some excellent things there. So really, thank you for spending your time with us. Thank you, Celeste, and thanks to all of our speakers, Trishla, Gabrielle, Menzo, and of course our behind the scenes team, Marina and Hannah. Now, if you're interested in the auto sector, don't miss our next webinar on BMW's EV strategy, happening next Tuesday. That's the 16th of September at 2 o'clock. Ben Scott and Philip Hunter will present their insights on the next phase of BMW's electrification journey. And until then, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. And bye-bye, and have a good rest of the day.